We are live. Good evening, everyone. Welcome once again to Civil War Seattle and our first Wednesdays with Savas Beatie Authors Series. And for May, I'm really happy to welcome Dr. Alex Rossino. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Rossino. I think I Z'd that a little bit too much.
Yep, right.
And tonight we're going to discuss his recent book on the Confederate advance, Confederate campaign, Confederate activity in Maryland during the Maryland campaign of 1862. So, Alex, why don't we start by letting you introduce yourself to everybody here? You're probably a new name to some of our audience this evening as we go.
Right, sure. So thanks, Richard. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. It's near my bedtime here on the East Coast, but it's late. Anyway, no, my name's, as you've read, my name is Alex Rossino. I'm a PhD in history. I actually started my historical career as an historian, working on the European theater right before and during the Second World War. And worked at the Holocaust Museum for 9 years. But as a result of being burned out from dealing with that, I took a break from history for a long time, actually, but not really from being interested in it, just from writing it, that kind of doing sort of hardcore study. And then I moved up to here in Maryland. I live in Boonsboro, Maryland, or very close to Boonsboro on the west side of South Mountain. So the Blue Ridge Mountain Range goes up, across most of the eastern coast. And in Maryland, it's called South Mountain, as opposed to in Virginia, where it's called the Blue Ridge. I've lived here since 2013, and moving up here really kind of spurred an interest re-spurred, I should say, my interest in the Civil War, because it's something that I'd long had an interest in, the history of it. Ever since my grandfather would read portions of the American Heritage Pictorial History of the Civil War, which is, I think, it's like the starter book for a lot of historians, right?
Those maps in that book.
Yeah, the maps. Well, I mean, when you're 12 years old, you look at the maps, you're like, wow, this is great. So the first book I wrote as a result of it was actually a novel, which is called 6 Days in September. Put that up here. And the reason I wrote a novel is I'd never written one before. And so I really wanted to branch out a little bit and do something that I hadn't done. But it really kindled my interest in the especially the Confederate side of the story, because that's what 6 Days in September is about. I've since written a Union companion that Savas Beatie is waiting to publish called The Guns of September. And that's fascinating too, but it's a very different story. It's incredible how different they are when you look at them from the different perspectives of the different armies.
Sure.
And over the years, I collected more and more research and found myself with hundreds of pages of notes and sources and all sorts of stuff. And I went, I've got a lot of material here. And as I'm going around talking to people about the novel, I'm running into people who don't like to read novels, but they're interested in the history. And then I ran into people who are interested in the history, but they don't like to read or interested in novels, but they don't like to read history. So it was kind of like, well, why not try and please both audiences? I've got a novel for those who want to read that way, and a piece of nonfiction now for those who are interested in that kind of history. So that resulted in Their Maryland, which is the book that we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah. So do you have, now that you've done each, do you have a preference? Like, do you enjoy the creative side of the novel part of it? Or do you really prefer just a hardcore academic military history approach to telling the story?
So that's an interesting question, actually. So I do really like writing history, but after I wrote the novel, I enjoyed it even more. And I would have to say that my writing got much stronger. My historical writing, nonfiction writing, got much stronger working on fiction. And I would recommend to anyone who has any interest in writing nonfiction to write fiction, even just as practice exercise, short stories, try and hone your craft. And because I couldn't believe how different I approached the subject when I was writing a novel, I actually had to throw out the first version because I got 4 chapters in and went, well, this sounds like history. So I started to go back into it, wrote it more as a novel. And then when I finally came back to writing nonfiction, it was a breeze. It was like writing a novel, except for having to source things, So it was really, I would have to say that I like writing nonfiction better than fiction, but I find that I can do either of one of them adequately, and I find that they really help one another.
Yeah. Did you find that your narrative building, I mean, obviously your writing, like you said, improved, that probably just your simple narrative ability when you come back to nonfiction, but did the way that you look at sources change because you're seeing things, you're seeing the narrative construction a little differently?
So that's interesting. So There Maryland is a book of 7 essays that can be read individually or they can be read straight through. And I did that because I had sources that were telling me a certain story about certain portions of this campaign that didn't gel with what I was finding in previously written histories.
Yeah.
So my nonfiction historical approach is not narrative history. I don't think I've ever written narrative history. I've only ever written analytical history, I call it. I focus on topics and subjects, and then I delve into those and I fit them within the historical context so that you get a lot of analysis of sources, a lot of analysis of the events themselves, not just a recounting of the events.
Sure.
And I would say that writing narrative in a fictional sense was a real challenge for me because I've never written that way before.
Yeah.
And so it helped, but it even helped with the analytical stuff, putting together the sources in a way that I wanted to make approachable and readable, and more important, to write it in an active voice so that as people read it, they get through the chapter and they think, boy, that didn't take any time at all. It just carries you through. The sources just carry you through the reading. And so that's what's important to me. One more word about narrative. I actually think that narrative history is a reason why there are so many errors in history. Because too many historians want to write novels, but they think that they can do it as a historian, and I don't think it makes sense. And they also try and take so much material in and throw it back at you that they overlook things, they misread stuff, they misinterpret things. So I would actually stick with the analytical approach as my preference.
I see.
But I understand people want to read a story,
Sure.
And that's why they still go back to Patton, because he writes a story. That's why you read Glenn Tucker, because he was a journalist writing history about Gettysburg and Chickamauga and things like that. Shelby Foote, incredibly popular novelist who wrote history, so same thing.
Yeah. So you mentioned the sources are what started to steer you in the direction of this project with There Maryland. You were starting to see something develop that you hadn't seen before. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that, if you can, without spilling the beans on everything. And then I guess maybe we could even start with this, is sort of set the stage for our viewers a little bit as to what's happening, say the end of August of 1862, that's opening the door for where you pick up the story. Just a little background on that as far as Second Manassas and there, and we can get into that strategic situation and those decisions. So.
Yeah, sure. So, at the beginning of the summer, in June, Robert E. Lee, or toward the end of June, Robert E. Lee is named the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia due to Joseph Johnston being wounded. Lee then immediately starts planning more aggressive attacks on the Federal Army, pushes McClellan's army back down the peninsula, and finally off the peninsula after they decide to evacuate the peninsula in June, and then into July, early July. So the campaign then moves north. Lee hears about the new Army of Virginia that's been created, which is under John Pope, who's a Westerner who's been brought east because of his more trying to think of the word, more radical Republican agenda. So he's very much an aggressive general. He's a no quarter kind of a general. He wants to treat the rebellion like a rebellion rather than McClellan, who wants to treat it more conservatively and to win a battlefield victory, but not treat the enemy population like an enemy. And so Lee gets word of this and decides to launch a campaign north in order to punish Pope and to get him out of Virginia, a man that Lee called a miscreant. which is a pretty serious insult in the 19th century. You could call someone a miscreant now, and they're like, what does that mean? But back then, it was a pretty serious insult. So Lee pursues this campaign all the way up to the old battlefield of Manassas, where he ends up defeating Pope's army in a 2-day battle at Second Manassas, which results in, I think, one of only 2 incidents in the Civil War where this ever happens, where an army is annihilated on the field, basically. Mm-hmm. So the army of Virginia crumbles. Lee sees it fleeing in front of his troops back to the fortifications of Washington. And on the so that happens on the 30th of August. And so he finds himself at this point with a decision to make, what exactly to do at this point. And so what the sources have told, or what the histories will tell you, is that Lee faced what Joseph Harsh calls a strategic dilemma. Mm-hmm. And this is something that everyone will be familiar with. Lee couldn't attack the fortifications at Washington because they were too strong. He couldn't retreat to feed his men to the Shenandoah Valley, because that would have opened the door to the east for the Federal Army to move south and advance on Richmond. He couldn't stay where he was because there was no forage for his animals and no food for his men in Northern Virginia. So this strategic dilemma leaves him with no choice but to advance into Maryland, where there hasn't been any fighting, food is abundant, et cetera, et cetera. So this comes from a story that was told or a letter that was written by Colonel Charles Marshall, who was one of Lee's aides in the 1870s, in response to a history that was written by the Comte de Paris, or the Count of Paris, who was during the Civil War was a staff member on McClellan's staff. And the Count of Paris wrote Marshall for information about why Lee embarked upon this campaign, because according to the Count of Paris's sources and the way he ends up writing it out in volume 2 of his multi-volume history, is that Lee enters Maryland in order to incite rebellion. And so Marshall takes exception to this. He comes up with the whole strategic dilemma thing, says we didn't have a choice. This was an attempt to move the Army of Northern Virginia north so that we could feed our troops and take the war out of Virginia. So it was basically, we took the offensive in order to pursue a defensive objective, which is so that we could carry the war out of Virginia, right? Mm-hmm. So, okay, it all sounds good. It's all, makes sense when you listen to it and stuff like that. The problem is that we have no evidence from Lee that he ever thought any of those things. He never said to anyone in any way, shape, or form that these were his objectives or that was his objective. As a matter of fact, the only thing he consistently says is that he entered Maryland to feed his men because the army was in bad shape, and that he entered Maryland in order to give Marylanders the opportunity to choose whether they wanted to rise up against the federal government and join the Confederacy, or whether they were going to stay put in their current situation. So basically, the Count of Paris got it correct in 1876. But at the same time, the lost cause, one aspect of the lost cause ideology is being developed here, and that is Lee doesn't make mistakes, right? So that's why there's the blaming. You blame D.H. Hill for the loss of the campaign because of the lost orders. You blame in 1863. You blame Longstreet for the defeat at Gettysburg because it couldn't possibly be Robert E. Lee's fault because he's infallible. This kind of thing. So all these things so when you look at the evidence itself, all it says consistently is that Lee had those 2 objectives: to feed his army and to if not incite rebellion in Maryland, give the Marylanders a chance to rebel if they wanted to.
So how early have you found evidence of him having this strategy? Is there any indication he was thinking of these things before he moves north from Richmond towards Pope? I'm sure he was. He's a great strategic general. He's thinking several steps ahead, but is there evidence to that was a longer term strategy with Pope, or was it like, let's deal with Pope, and then you see him start saying stuff about this?
So this actually goes, this is beyond the scope of my study, but the things that I've read show that bringing this border states, so bringing Maryland and Kentucky and Missouri, all of those states, bringing them into the Confederacy was stated Confederate government policy.
Okay.
And Lee, of course, was very familiar with stated Confederate policy because he had been the military advisor to Jefferson Davis before he took Johnston's place as the head of the Army of Northern Virginia. So he knows the whole strategic picture. So even if we don't have evidence that he said beforehand, oh, well, I want to go and let's see what we can do about bringing Maryland into the fold. He knows that that's an objective of the Confederate government, and therefore, if it can be completed or fulfilled, that he's going to do it. So he's carrying out stated policy.
Okay. So this doesn't all just originate with the victory at Second Manassas. This is part of a larger picture.
It's part of a larger picture. Okay. Yep. And if you want to, there's a book that Joseph Harsh wrote called, I think it's High Tide. Hold on a second. I'm getting that confused with, anyway, it's the one that's before, I can't remember the name of it. Sorry about that. It's the one that's before Taken at the Flood. Oh, Confederate Tide Rising. That's what it's called.
Okay. So now let's get into your specific angle on this and your timeline, and where does your interpretation of these sources that you found that drove you into this interpretation of these events start, and where does it go? I guess sort of I guess I'll just let you tell us what you tell us in the book to some degree.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's no problem. It's a bit of a convoluted story, but the one thing I noticed as I was reading through Lee's dispatches to Davis and then his report following the campaign is that as early as September 3rd, he had made the decision to enter Maryland, and that the consistent theme of it is, as he wrote to Davis, that's why I got my notes so I can make sure to read this quote correctly. So he writes, if it is ever desired to give material aid to Maryland and afford her an opportunity for throwing off the oppression to which she is now subject, remember Maryland's under martial law at this time, this would seem to be the most favorable, because his army is right there at the doorstep. All they have to do is march north to Leesburg and then cross the river at any number of points there, right? So he writes that as early as the 3rd. And then 2 days later, he repeats pretty much that statement almost verbatim in a second dispatch to Jefferson Davis, although this time he's more assertive about what it is that he's planning. So he says, this army is about entering Maryland. We are about to do this. As a matter of fact, when he wrote that on September 5th, it had already occurred, because some of D.H. Hill's men had already crossed at Nolan's Ferry. Some Alabamians had already crossed at Nolan's Ferry, and they were in the process of breaking down parts of the berm to drain the C&O Canal. So they had already started the operation when he wrote this. And then, of course, 3 days later, when he gets to, after he's in Frederick, Maryland for a couple of days, he's been there on the 6th, there's the proclamation that's issued, which is written by Charles Marshall and then signed off on by Lee. So, and obviously Lee agreed with the sentiment that's in it. And this says clearly, our army is prepared to assist you with the power of its arms in regaining the rights of which you have been despoiled. This, citizens of Maryland, is our mission. It's unambiguous that that's what he was planning on doing. And then if you look at his campaign report from about a year later on August 13th, written on August 13th, 1863, Lee looks back on the campaign and he says, it was hoped that military success might afford us an opportunity to aid the citizens of Maryland in any efforts they might be disposed of to recover their liberties. So he basically restates what he had said at the beginning of the campaign. So even after a year, his opinion of the campaign had not changed, and the reasons why he had launched it had not changed. So when I look at that, the consistency of the different quotes, I realized that why isn't anyone taking this seriously? When I'm looking at the histories of it, and all I see is Lee wouldn't have been so naive as to think that the secession or rebellion would have broken out in Maryland, and that his objectives were military and not political, and all of these things. And I'm like, well, you're obviously not reading the same documents that Lee wrote that I am, because because that's what he says. So it was simply, this is what Lee said, and I'm an historian and I'm supposed to report what Lee said. I'm not supposed to add my own conjecture. That this is, unless there's a gap and I'm forced to, but it's unambiguous in this case.
Yeah. So now how far do we get there? About the 6th, where they're
September
crossing.
6th.
So develop the timeline of the advance into Maryland, like the from a military perspective, where divisions and troops are and how far they're advancing, and what's happening in Maryland in reaction to their arrival. Is it what they had hoped? Is it different, or is it like what have you found as far as the expected reactions and actions of the Marylanders versus what actually happened? And then maybe after that, then we can talk about what the results of that are, how that factors in.
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, the first Confederate troops under D.H. Hill cross at Nolan's Ferry. They also cross in a couple of other locations, or start their plan to cross in a couple of other locations. On the 5th of September, Stonewall Jackson's command, which is about this at this time, it has been estimated to be as high as 30,000 men, cross at White's Ford, which is a very small, obscure place. Even today, it's very hard to find. And it's just not a common kind of place where you would run across. And Jackson then moves north across around the C&O Canal has a tow path where the mules would pull the canal boats down, right? So that's wide enough for at that point in time, probably for men to move 4 abreast, which is how the Army of Northern Virginia liked to march. And so they would they move north and cross the canal at a certain place, lock number 27, move farther north there, camped by the river for a night, and then advance to Frederick the next day. And Longstreet's command then comes up behind, which the other half of the army comes up behind Jackson. And so by roughly the 9th of September, all of the troops are situated around, in the vicinity of Frederick, Maryland. What they find is what they get is a mixed reception. The closer to the river that they are, at least it looks like the sources say that the closer to the river they are, the more sympathetic the Maryland population was, which would make sense because there's a lot of cross-border or cross-state line and cross-river commerce, and also marriages. So you have a lot of families that are marrying. Elijah Veers White, for example, a cavalry colonel, and the border guard controls the border cavalry, Loudoun County Border Cavalry. He's known for being in Virginia for being a Virginia cavalry officer, but he's actually from Poolesville, Maryland, so he comes from right across the river. When they get to Frederick, the greeting is actually warm, quite warm. There are a number of people a number of reports of some yelling and celebrating in the streets, and the women coming out and waving flags, rebel flags at them, the different things like that, giving them clothes, giving them food, water, et cetera, et cetera. And then the night of the 6th, when Lee is in Frederick, actually, and his army is starting to collect, in different vicinities around the town, places around the town, there are descriptions of the town being alive with banquets and parties, and their Confederate soldiers are out until 10 o'clock when the curfew comes. So, I mean, it's actually much more encouraging than it's been portrayed. Not that they expected, because they actually expected, Lee's troops expected that people would be flocking to their colors, right? The one thing that they're disappointed by is it seems like initially there are recruits coming in, and they're coming in larger numbers, and there are hundreds of people. There are recruits of small groups of men coming from Pennsylvania to join the Army of Northern Virginia. But there are also these reports are really kind of erroneous, because eventually only about between 180 and 220 men joined the Army of Northern Virginia during the campaign, whereas they had expected as many as 50,000. And they're also expecting word about or word of a rebellion breaking out or a riots breaking out in Baltimore any day now, and none of that word ever comes. So as they move to the northwest, toward Hagerstown, and then of course, the other other parts of the Army branch off to go to the different places that surround Harper's Ferry. They find also a mixed, and probably even more mixed reception. So in Middletown, for example, which is the next town over the Catoctin Mountains down the National Road from Frederick, it is almost entirely Union. The descriptions of the place are very negative. And then in Boonsboro, it's mixed. Where I live, that's also on the National Road, and in Hagerstown, it's actually quite warm. The response is quite warm, which is really interesting because Hagerstown's much closer to the Pennsylvania line than Frederick is. So, but still, when it comes to recruits, there just aren't any.
Yeah. So one thing I'm curious about your opinion on is, we hear the second incursion into the North by Lee. We hear much more about the efforts to acquire forage and supplies and that sort of stuff, and it's something I've just not seen a lot talked about with Maryland. So is that, if we're getting into that, double digits days of September in this story, what's happening with that regard? Are they really fanning out and like cleaning out people's supplies and a lot of the things that rile the people in Pennsylvania and Maryland in 1863? We don't hear much about that about 1862.
Yeah, completely different story because Maryland was considered to be a friendly state, and Lee wants to encourage the state to join the Confederacy if it's interested in joining the Confederacy. And so these people are considered friends. And so anything that is taken is to be paid for. But the problem is that they only have Confederate script to pay for it. So it would be like somebody coming in, coming down and saying, well, I want to buy all of your whatever. Say you were at an apple orchard. I want to buy all of your apples, and then they pay you Canadian money with it. I mean, what are you going to do with Canadian money? So in the States, so it's like that. So the way it gets portrayed in the Unionist leaning sources is theft. This is theft. Yeah. So they stole our horses, they stole our beef cattle, they stole our crops, they stole this, they stole that, all that stuff. When actually it isn't stealing. It's that the only thing that the Confederate troops had to pay with is with Confederate, script. So they didn't have a choice. Now there are a lot of people who don't mind taking Confederate script. So there are the stores that take Confederate script in Frederick, for example. They sell out by Saturday night. They're completely sold out of stuff. And remember, the Army of Northern Virginia crosses over and gets there on Saturday. So by the end of the day, they're all pretty much all sold out already. And then there are people who along the way who sell beef cattle to them and sell horses and sell crops and things like that. It's not a large number, but there is evidence that some people did. So it's a very different campaign than in Pennsylvania, which Pennsylvania is considered to be an outright hostile state, and that all the rules are off, right? Yeah. So do whatever you need to do in order to feed yourselves and get supplies.
I see. So it was a much more transactional approach to these things. Maryland in 1862 than
exactly. Yeah. Let me add too that in 1863, Lee gave the same orders when his army marched across the thin neck of Maryland by Hagerstown, that Marylanders' property was not to be disturbed unless you paid for it. Same thing.
What's your assessment of Confederate morale at this point? I've seen mixed things on this, that they didn't feel like they wanted to be leaving. They were there to defend the South, and moving north from Virginia was problematic in the eyes of some of the soldiers. Is that a significant factor at all for this, or something you thought one way or the other?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So morale, I find at the beginning of the campaign is very high. Very, very high. And the number of accounts of people having a grand time crossing the Potomac and being very excited about going to Baltimore, because that's where they all think they're going. They all think they're going to Baltimore.
Yeah.
They're excited about that. They're excited about bringing new recruits into the fold. Those units, especially in Stonewall Jackson's command, that have a lot of Marylanders in them already, people who have come south from the state and are fighting in Virginia to free their homeland. They blow this up into a big, like, it's going to be a party. You're not going to believe what you're going to see there and what you're going to experience, and how people are going to be happy to see you and things like that. So the reality kind of strikes them a little bit. It strikes a harsh tone with the reality is that there's a much more mixed or muted response than they had expected. It's more than we've been told. It's more favorable than has come down through the histories, but it's less favorable than the Confederate soldiers expected at the time.
Sure.
As for those who didn't want to enter Maryland because they were fighting for the South rather than didn't want to invade the North, Maryland isn't the North, right? At this point in time, it's a slaveholding state that the most Confederate opinion has been held in the Union by the point of a bayonet. It's under martial law. People have been arrested. You cannot voice political opposition. Opposition newspapers have been closed. The writ of habeas corpus has been, which means all your legal rights have been, as a defendant, have been rendered null and void by a tyrannical or despotic federal government. This is them talking, right? So all of those things are important. Now, that said, there are 6 sources that say, well, so and so and I, well, we didn't want to enter Maryland because we didn't want to invade anyone else's country. So that opinion definitely existed in the Army. I'm just saying that compared to the number of people or the number of sources that have enthusiasm for the campaign and view it positively, they're very small.
Okay.
So my opinion is that, or my judgment is that that opinion or that myth has been perpetuated in order to excuse why things didn't work in Maryland. It's another part of the whole lost cause ideology. I think that that's related to it in a sense, even though it comes along at a later point.
I see. So now, at the risk of jumping too far ahead here, but we also got to be aware of time, I guess, a little bit and get into some of the good stuff.
Yeah, sure.
So I think you mentioned, I've seen you mention this in the past, and it came as a surprise to me. It was something I hadn't really seen before, thought about, that where Lee anticipated an engagement would take place would be a little bit contingent upon what happens with the citizenry in Maryland.
Right.
The fact that he envisioned that the battle may happen in Maryland, may happen in Pennsylvania. I've seen you mention that, and I don't know where in the timeline this would fit, but it seems like this maybe before we talk about the lost orders and that kind of stuff. Is this idea more appropriately put before that, or is there something we should address before I ask about that?
No, I mean, we can talk about this beforehand. Okay. That's fine. It's a little bit of a convoluted story because you have to piece the evidence together. And what I found is that as of September 6th, Lee seems to have assumed that the minute his army would set foot in the state, that it would foment rebellion in the state, and people would flock to join, Baltimore, rise into rebellion in the Eastern Shore, and people would run to join his army, and it would cause problems for the federal government, etc. So he attends a dinner in Frederick, the only dinner he attended when he was in Frederick City, invited there by a collection of sympathizers, and they basically tell him at this dinner that they don't know why the Army of Northern Virginia is there, and wonder if he can explain it to them. And when that takes him aback, and he finds, as he puts it, they were embarrassed as to why we were here. That leads to the proclamation being written the next day on the 7th and then announced on the 8th. So at the same time, a gentleman either has a conversation with Lee at this dinner and then goes back to Baltimore, or in the direction of Baltimore, or he meets Lee at his headquarters at the Best Farm, and then goes back to Baltimore. But in either case, he ends up getting being interviewed by a special correspondent from the Philadelphia Inquirer, who publishes what the man told him that Lee said to him. And what Lee said to him is, and this appeared in the Inquirer on September 12th, says that we have now come to redeem our pledge to the people of this state, and we extend an olive branch to them. And should they accept it, we shall welcome and protect them with the assurance that the next battleground will be in Pennsylvania. But should they not come forward, after having been amply assured that their property would be unmolested and every guarantee given that the Southern Army should remain on Maryland soil for the maintenance of their sacred rights, then the battleground must hereafter be in Maryland. So with that statement, it shows that already as of the time that he had started to develop Special Orders number 191, Lee intended to fight this battle in Maryland. He didn't intend to go to Pennsylvania. So that part of the story has been lost. Or hasn't been ever reported. So that's new.
Sure.
So then on his way, the issue then is where would this battle be fought? Well, as a result of the operation against Harper's Ferry, Lee envisions this battle will be fought west of South Mountain, so west of the Blue Ridge, somewhere between Boonsboro and Hagerstown. So if you could bring up that map that I sent you, that'll help people understand better what we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
So this is what Lee. This is kind of a visualization of what Lee expected to take place after Special Orders number 191 had been carried out and Harper's Ferry had been captured. So remember that this road in the middle of the map here from the black. Nope, if you can
Sorry
go
about
back.
that.
That's okay.
There we go.
So if you see where McClellan's army is, you see Stuart guarding the passes here over at Hagen's Gap and Jefferson over the Catoctin Mountain Range, and then the black arrow. There you go. That goes up toward Bolivar, and then Turner's Gap and Fox's Gap, where D.H. Hill is. Right. So Lee, of course, took that route with Longstreet and Hill and the rest of his army that was not involved in the Harper's Ferry operation. And then on the 11th of September, Lee moved north with Longstreet toward Hagerstown, and then it camped between Hagerstown and Funkstown. During that time, or while he was on that march, he found high ground along a place called Beaver Creek. And this appears to have been the place where Lee decided that he wanted this battle to take place. And he wanted it to take place for a couple of reasons. One is it's west of South Mountain. So if he can engage the Federal Army this far away from Washington, D.C., and north of the capital, not the fortified side of the capital, then he envisions that if he can win a crushing victory similar to what his army had just won at Second Manassas, that there wouldn't be anywhere for that army or for the remnants of that army to flee to. So the issue that the challenge that he had found himself faced with after Second Manassas, the fact that he couldn't get at the rest of the Federal Army, right? He wouldn't have to face that here in Maryland. So in Special Orders number 191, this comes through pretty clearly when he writes, the paragraph 9 of the Special Orders, he writes that the commands of Jackson, McLaws, Walker, after they have accomplished the objects for which they have been detached, so that's the take Harper's Ferry, will join the main body of the army at Boonsboro or Hagerstown. And during that time, he picked out, this location of Beaver Creek. Now, these red arrows are ways that the army could have come together again, following what Lee's orders were, could have come together again for that fight at Beaver Creek Heights. Or Jackson could have alternately taken that green arrow, the dotted line arrow, through Shepherdstown, through Sharpsburg, and then up to meet Longstreet's command at Beaver Creek Heights. Now, the second reason, I mentioned two reasons why Lee picked that line. One is because of the location west of South Mountain. The other is because of the nature of the terrain there. It's very high, very tall ground that is rough, and it's west of a creek or behind a water course. Even though Beaver Creek is much smaller than even Antietam Creek, it's still behind a water course. So it makes it difficult for things like artillery to get over at certain places, stuff like that. So if you go to the next picture that I sent you, you can get a sense of the terrain here. This is what would have been the right center of Lee's line. And so the fence, the kind of barbed wire that you can see in the front of the photograph there, it's very hard to find a good way to get these grounds adequately. Is where the creek is. So you see the creek down here in the front, and then you see the bucket loader or whatever you want to call that on there, the excavator that's up there, up to the top of that hill. That's got to be about 400 feet right there, and that's very rough terrain. And so this terrain is the center right. If you go to the next photograph, this is the terrain at the right side of what would have been Lee's line. So you can see it's this extended hill that his men would have occupied the top of, and that Federals would have been required to advance up. Now, this had two real advantages to it. One is you can see in the distance there in that photograph, that's South Mountain. That anchors the left side of that line. The right side of the line, which is behind, if you're standing in this, looking at this image, you're on the road there looking at it, and behind you is Antietam Creek. So it's anchored on the right by Antietam Creek and very rough terrain. And on the left-hand side, it's anchored by about 1.5 miles, maybe 2 miles away. It's anchored by South Mountain. So it's extremely hard. It would have been very difficult to turn, a position to turn, and it would have been a very difficult position to take. So if Lee had had a chance to fight here, which is where he wanted to fight, then we may have been talking about a different story or different outcome to the fight itself.
Is he at all factoring in the change in command in Union Army with his selections at this point, or is this just ground he thinks no matter if anybody's commanding the Union Army, this is where he wants his army to be strategically no matter what?
It's if anyone is commanding the army at this point in time, but he does know, I think he has a very clear idea that McClellan is the commander. There's one piece of contemporary evidence that's very indirect, and that's the design of Special Orders number 191 themselves. I mean, he puts them in motion on September 10th, and he anticipates Harper's Ferry is going to fall on September 14th, and that he'll be able to get his army back together by the 15th or the 16th. And he does that all because he assumes that the Federal Army will advance slowly. And if it advances slowly, that's probably under the command of George McClellan, right? Yeah. So the other thing is that even though there are no contemporary sources where Lee actually says, I know, McClellan is advancing or he has troops here or whatever, or anyone else says anything like that, there are a number of other sources from Buck privates all the way up to Dorsey Pender, General Dorsey Pender, which show that everyone in Frederick as of September 6th knew that George McClellan was back in command of the Army of the Potomac. So if everyone knew and privates were hearing about it in the street, and Pender says that people knew beforehand that McClellan was back in command, I don't see any way that Lee could have not have heard or not have known that. So we have to conclude that he didn't. There's no direct evidence, but it doesn't mean that he didn't know. And the evidence actually shows that his troops knew. So why wouldn't Lee know?
Sure. So we may have viewers who are not familiar with the Lost Order in explicit detail. So why don't you touch on that a little bit? Because we've mentioned it a few times now.
Sure.
What happened with that? What is that story for someone who is not familiar with that? And then from that point, what changes, and then what leads us to the engagement at Sharpsburg? We have about 15 minutes left, so I think we could probably
I can do that. Yeah, sure, no problem. So if you could pull up that last map that I sent to you, it's the one of the Confederate encampments around Frederick. Yeah. So this is where the Confederate Army camped around Frederick, and if you look up here toward the center, you'll see SO 191 found along Iamsville Road right there, where the B&O Railroad spur comes off the road. Yeah, exactly right there.
Cursor moving there, yeah.
Right. So Lee has, I think, about 11 copies of this order developed. It's his operational order for the assault on Harper's Ferry and the capture of Harper's Ferry and what his army is supposed to do afterward. And these are all distributed to all the major generals, and then there are copies made for the records, the official records for the Confederate government, and things like that. One of these copies of these orders are addressed to D.H. Hill, who's a brigadier general. No, he's a major general at this point in time. Major general, is he? You know what? I can't remember his rank, but I think he's a major general at this time. That are distributed to these different generals. And that order, the copy of the order to D.H. Hill, is 2 pages that are wrapped around 2 cigars. So there's no envelope. They're wrapped around 2 cigars, and they are found in a field on the 13th of September, which is 3 days after the Army of Northern Virginia has left the Frederick area. They're found in a field by men with the 27th Indiana, and then go up the chain of command to McClellan. And it gives McClellan the understanding that Lee is after Harper's Ferry and that he has split his army into 4 or 5 different columns, 4 columns, I think he thinks at this point in time, 4 columns in order to do so. And that it means that if he moves fast enough, he can attack the army in 2 different places, at the gaps of South Mountain, and then destroy it in detail, which is what he says that he can do. He thinks he can do. The other thing that he thinks he can do is that he can relieve the siege of Harper's Ferry, or lift the siege of Harper's Ferry, by pushing through at a place called Crampton's Gap, which is the southernmost of the gaps that are passes. Crampton's Pass, the southernmost of the passes that are on South Mountain and closest to Harper's Ferry. So if he pushes through there, then he can take the Confederate troops there from behind, and he can. I don't think we have a map of it, do we? Yeah, there you go.
This one we can kind of see.
Yeah, there you go. So Crampton's Gap, you can see where Crampton's Gap is right there. So if you push through the 6th Corps, which is on this map, is around Buckystown, because this is actually September. This is September 12th and 13th. So if he pushes that corps there, so he'll be able to attack McAnderson and McLaws in the rear, and then beat the army in detail. This leads to a fight at South Mountain on September 14th. As McClellan pushes his troops forward, and Lee is forced to return with Longstreet from the Hagerstown, Funkstown area to defend the passes at South Mountain, where D.H. Hill's command is. Turner's Gap and Fox's Gap, right in the middle of that map right there. Exactly. So Lee had never intended to do that. He said that multiple times. He never intended to defend the passes at South Mountain. What he wants to do is he wants to pull Hill's command back to Beaver Creek Heights, and then have Jackson and the rest meet them there for a fight at that place. But because Lee is forced to bring Longstreet past Beaver Creek Heights, he can't assume that position. So he fights the battles at Turner's and Fox's Gap, loses because he's heavily outnumbered, doesn't know what the story is with the tactical dispositions up there, can't command it himself because he can't ride a horse at this point in time because his hands are both in bandages. He's got a broken bone in his right hand and a sprained left wrist. His right arm is generally carrying it in a sling, so he can't ride. So he doesn't go to the top of the mountain, and he leaves the control of the fight to Hill initially, and then Longstreet afterward. And then he learns that Franklin's 6th Corps, U.S. Army 6th Corps has moved, or Army of the Potomac 6th Corps has pushed through Crampton's Gap and now stands between him and the Rump Army of Northern Virginia, where D.H. Hill is right there by Boonsboro, Keedysville, that kind of area right there. And in between them, yeah, exactly. In between them and Anderson and McLaws at the base of Pleasant Valley, there is now a whole Federal Army Corps, 13,000 men in between them. So what Lee decides to do then is he decides to move closer to Virginia in order to bring him closer to Jackson, so that Jackson could come and the rest of his troops can come and meet him there. And at Sharpsburg, he finds tall heights behind a watercourse, which sounds exactly like what he was looking for at Beaver Creek, and decides to stand and fight there. And that's why the battle takes place at Sharpsburg.
So you've, with a few minutes here left, you have a pretty specific theory on who you think lost.
Yeah. Do you want to spill those
the
beans
special
now?
orders, and I think this would be a really fun way to end. I'd love to talk to you about your analysis of the photo of the Confederate troops in marching, but maybe that's a subject for another time. But since we've touched on the Special Orders 191, you were the first person who really got that specific on why you think they wound up in the field where they were and whose pocket they may have fallen out of. So if you think we can hit that in 10 minutes, I'd love to wrap on that. And also, I do want to remind anyone, if you have any other questions for Dr. Rossino here, throw them in the comments now so we can grab them on the way out here.
Yeah, because I can stay a little bit later. I don't need to.
We'll do that, and then just leave a couple minutes so I'll read off whatever questions we do get. And
okay. If you can go back to that map of Confederate encampments, that would help.
Yeah, let's.
So for many years, D.H. Hill, Daniel Harvey Hill, was blamed for the loss of the Special Orders number 191 because Colonel Silas Colgrove, the commander of the 27th Indiana, published an article in the 1880s. I think it was 1880s, might have been the 1870s, somewhere around there, within a couple decades after the war, saying that we found an order lying on grounds that had been occupied by D.H. Hill's troops. Okay, so I said, well, where's the evidence for that? So, because that's all I'm interested in is the evidence. I'm not interested in what people say or they saw or what they think. I want to know what the documents say about this. So, taking a look at the documents, if you could pull that map a little bit to the right.
Oops. I touch it and I skip ahead.
Yeah, no worries.
Is this good?
Just come out a little bit.
Okay, the other way. You want to go this way?
Oh, yeah, perfect, exactly.
Right there.
So what I want to do is I want to see down where it says Rhodes, Garland, Colquitt down back there. Yeah, down here in the that's what I need to. Yeah, exactly. Okay. If you can pull that up, just pull the map up a little bit. There you go. Perfect.
Yeah. And the 191 there, everybody's
191's up here. That's about 3 miles away from this location down here, where you see all these Anderson, Garland, Rhodes, Colquitt, White Oak Springs Farm, Ballinger's Creek, etc. All of the sources from D.H. Hill's command that I've been able to find show that this is where his command camped. This is where his division camped. They camped along Ballinger's Creek. And I didn't find any evidence that any Confederate unit had ever camped anywhere near where the Special Orders were found. It doesn't mean that no one camped there, but D.H. Hill certainly didn't camp there, and his army was not, or his division was not in that direction either. So if you had a courier that was going in that direction, then that courier must have been drunk or something, because he's going in the completely opposite direction from Lee's headquarters, which is down here at Best's Grove. So where you see D.R. Jones and Anderson, you see the Best Grove between in the middle of that. That's where Lee's headquarters is. So if the orders are coming from Lee's headquarters, then they must go to the west and not to the north, right? So that means that the loss of the orders there, or those orders being carried to that point, is an outlier. It means that there's no reason for anyone to be over in that direction. So that means that it's someone probably that we don't really expect to have a copy of the orders. And I think that person was William Nelson Pendleton. And Pendleton was the commander of the Army's Reserve Artillery for the last couple of weeks in August. He had been suffering terribly from malaria. Those who have had malaria before or know anything about malaria know that it's accompanied by terrible and uncontrollable diarrhea. And so when you feel that need, you have to get off your horse and go wherever you need to go. So if you could go back to the photograph, that would be great. That's perfect. So
accidentally touched it again.
Yeah, no worries. So, there's a captain in D.H. William Nelson Pendleton's command who does not like Pendleton because he's not a very popular officer, because he's considered to be extremely incompetent. And this man says two things in his diary. He says, one, that Pendleton is pretending to be sick again. So it could be that he was pretending, or it could be that he had another bout of malaria-induced diarrhea, right? Because you have to remember, these are old men at this time; they're in their 50s. He could have easily been. I think he's actually in his maybe in his 60s at this point in time. And also that Pendleton is staying at a farmhouse. So it was common knowledge at the time that Confederate officers in this vicinity, when they were in Frederick, they stayed at the houses of prominent people who were Confederate sympathizers in Frederick. They stayed at hotels in Frederick, or they stayed at the houses of sympathizers out in the countryside. So to me, it makes sense for someone like Pendleton to have been given a copy of the orders, and then was making his way back to his house, or the house he was staying in, which is a farm that these orders were found on. The farm was owned by a man named de Lashboot, who was part of a family of well-known Confederate sympathizers in the area. And so I think that Pendleton may have been going back to the house where he was staying in order to drop off these orders because they're really important, and he knows that. And then he was stricken with diarrhea, had to get off his horse and jump behind a bush and or tall grass or whatever, and lost them. Or he was just carrying them with them and then going up to Frederick to visit friends and family. Because another thing about Pendleton that's pertinent here is that Pendleton was, before the war, for several years before the war, he was the rector at All Saints Episcopal Church in Frederick. So he knows a lot of people in town here. Yeah. So those two things make me think that Pendleton, and there's more to the argument, sure. Make me think that those two things make me think that Pendleton was the one who lost them. The other thing is that Pendleton has a reason to be carrying these orders, even though they're addressed to D.H. Hill. And that is because Pendleton, in the same paragraph where Hill is given his orders to act as the rear guard of the army, Pendleton his command is mentioned that it will come up with D.H. Hill's command. So Pendleton has a reason to have these orders. There is no evidence that they were ever given to Pendleton. I have never seen anything about that, but we do know that as of September 8th, Pendleton was at Lee's headquarters, and that he knew what, to quote Pendleton, he said, "General Lee knows what he's about, and I will not say anything lest I give away lest this letter give away more than would be proper." So he has reason to have the orders. There's a place for him to stay there. He's got the health issues. The location of the orders being lost is an outlier. And then there's one other piece of evidence, and that is that as of September 8th, D.H. Hill moves a brigade from over on Ballinger's Creek. He moves it east across the railroad bridge there, across the Monocacy Bridge, at the junction, in order to put that brigade in position to act as the rear guard for the army. So that means that as of September 8th, D.H. Hill knows what his orders are. And then there's another piece of evidence is, and there's a photograph of this in the book. I should have sent it to you. If you take a real close look at the copy of the orders that fell into McClellan's hand, in his hands, it has September, and then the date is crossed out, and then 9th is written after that. So I'm thinking that this copy of the orders was an early copy of the orders that was originally written out to D.H. Hill. It went to Jackson. Jackson wrote out a copy of the orders for D.H. Hill because he thought that D.H. Hill was still under his command, as he was when they first crossed the river. And Hill had that copy of the orders for his entire life, and they're still in the archives at the University of North Carolina in the Southern Historical Collection. You can get them online. So I think this part of this errant copy of the orders, that was around, someone just handed them to William Nelson Pelson Pendleton and said, "Well, you have a reason to have these because your command is mentioned here." Yeah. So they were given to him. Now, where the cigars came from, I don't know. Why they were given to him, I don't know. I don't know if Pendleton smoked. I never found any evidence for it. I did find evidence that DHL smoked a pipe during the war, not cigars. So, for what that's worth. So anyway, that's my theory.
Well, it's an interesting one, and certainly the first time I've heard. Have you heard? Did you develop that idea just from what you were seeing coming through your research, or was there any hint of that somewhere else, or is that completely original Alex Rossino research?
Yeah, that's all mine.
Wow. Yeah. Well, it's captivating. Personal detail. I really like the imagery that puts forth and personalizes something that's typically kind of a abstract part of, they found this order or changed everything, but there's not much human element to that, and so it's nice to put a face on such a pivotal thing like that.
Yeah, sure.
So one last thing here, we got one question that came in. Let's see, Sandra Mosley was asking, she says, and this goes back again to the recruiting in Maryland and the men coming and not coming to the Confederate cause. She says, I've read accounts of Lee's army failing to recruit in Maryland due to the state of the soldiers, that they were ill-dressed, underfed, and things more than politics. So they just showed up as a ragtag looking bunch, and that's not much of a sales pitch. Do you think there's something to that?
Absolutely. Yeah, without question. There are numerous there are innumerable descriptions of the Confederate Army looking like an army of scarecrows, even to the extent that the pants were so worn out in some of these troops that they were indecent. They looked indecent, which means that they must have had skin showing. And as soon as recruits showed up expecting the Confederate Army to look like the Army of the Potomac or like federal troops that they had seen, and they see them looking the way that they did and smelling the way that they did, because you have to remember that they don't have showers or anything like that. They don't bear, most of them don't even have soap. As a matter of fact, during their stay in Frederick, Hood orders his entire brigade to go take a bath and wash their clothes in the river. So the state of the troops does dissuade a lot of people from joining, but I don't think it was a large number to begin with. Necessarily.
Yeah. Well, very well done. Thanks for answering, and I hope this was coherent for the viewer. I just had a few questions I wanted to touch on without just going from point A to the end, and I think we didn't get a lot of questions, so that means we did a good job and people understand what we're talking about.
I find that to be the case with a lot of stuff that I explain. They're like, you explained everything, so we don't have any questions.
Yeah, well, it reminds me of in school, when a school teacher asks if anybody has questions, they never do, and that's good or bad, I guess, when you're teaching. So thank you so much for coming on tonight and talking about this topic. And like I said, I really appreciate your angle on this, and new ideas and new information, and like I said, the personalizing some of this to me is a very effective part of the story, and I think for a lot of folks it is. So I think this is well done, and hopefully we'll have you back. So something in the future, which reminds me, what else do you have coming up? I know you talked about writing another historical novel from the northern perspective.
So
what do you have coming on in research as well? Do you have another follow-up book to this or anything?
Not specifically to this. I have an article coming out. There's an article out in the next issue of America's Civil War. It's on the contrabands of Harper's Ferry, it's an appendix from this book, altered in a slight way. I have an article coming out North and South that details what Lee's Beaver Creek plan was and gives all the evidence for it, so you can see all that stuff. I have an article coming out with the Journal of the Antietam Institute next year on Lee's hesitation on the morning of the 14th of September, because he did not leave Hagerstown as he claimed to have left Hagerstown at daybreak. He actually didn't leave until after the fighting started on South Mountain, which is very late. And let's see, I've got a book coming out, a co-written book with Gene Thorp called The Tale Untwisted, which is about George McClellan's response to the Lost Orders and use of the Lost Orders. That'll be out in July, I think. I'm currently waiting for the final galley of that to come back.
And that's Savas Beatie publication.
Savas Beatie too. Yep. And that'll have an incredible number of really detailed maps from my co-author, Gene Thorp, who's also a professional cartographer. He's done an amazing job with the maps. And then the follow-up to 6 Days in September, The Guns of September, we'll be working on editing that. It's about a third edited now, but we'll be working on editing that this fall, and it'll be out in 2023 at some point.
Well, you're busy. Sounds like
a lot busy.
All right. Well, want to thank everybody who tuned in tonight. I think we have some new viewers and things. So thanks for supporting us, and go get I have the code from Savas Beatie there rushing across the bottom of the screen to get a few bucks off to pick up Alex's book and get the whole story on what he talked about tonight, and be able to look at these maps a little closer up than we were able to show you tonight here on the screen. So thanks everybody. And Alex, thank you for being willing to join us tonight. It was a great program. And hopefully we can talk more Antietam in the future, because I think it's a campaign that captivates a lot of people, and we'd like to get your perspective on some other stuff down the line too. So.
Great, sounds good.
Okay, everybody. Well, thank you. Have a good night, everyone. Take care.